Welcome to Real Estate for Beginners. I'm Gershon Levy. In the previous episode, we talked about the actual escrow process and what needs to happen for a buyer to become the owner and for a seller to get their money from the deal. Now we're going to look at all of that on a timeline so we can figure out the order of operations of escrow. So now let's look at the escrow period visually on a timeline. Until now, we spoke about the main characters of the deal, the buyer, the seller, the lender, and the title company, and what their main roles and responsibilities were during the escrow period. Now let's talk about the order of operations and how it unfolds. One thing I want to state though is that every escrow period is different. First, it's different because of the length of the period. Some are shorter than others. It can be 10, 15 days, 20 days for cash deals. Some are longer than others. Some can be 45, 50, 60 days. On average, escrow periods are around 30 days. And I've built my timeline here based upon that 30-day average. The other thing to note is that not every deal unfolds like this. This is a typical escrow period, and this is how it typically unfolds. Certain things up here can change, like when they happen and how soon or later they happen, based upon what the buyer and the seller negotiate in the contract. It can also depend on the people involved in the deal. What do I mean by that? We have up here the appraisal, right, happening after the due diligence period. And some of you might say, well, when I bought a house, my appraisal happened before my due diligence period ended. And that's totally possible. I'm in a deal right now where the listing I have, they're doing a home inspection and an appraisal on the same day. This really depends on when the lender orders the appraisal. Now, what I've seen on average is that once it gets ordered, it generally happens around the 10, 11, 12 day mark. But it's possible for it to happen earlier or later, totally. Another thing is that you see these contingency dates that we talked about, the due diligence period, the appraisal contingency period, and the loan contingency period. The number of days that these contingencies last, right? This is, let's say 1 to 10 for due diligence, 1 to 20, let's say for appraisal, and 1 to 23 for loan. Just giving an example, right? Those periods are negotiated by the buyer and the seller. And I've seen due diligence that's 5 days. I've seen it where it's 14 days. So just remember that when we're talking about this, again, it's a typical escrow period and it could change based upon what's been negotiated. So let's get started. The first part of a deal, you have to have a contract. So an offer's been accepted and that purchase agreement is sent to the title company so the escrow officer can now open the escrow period. Now in the first week of escrow, a lot happens. It's very important. The first thing is that the buyer is going to wire that earnest money deposit, the good faith deposit, to the title company so they can hold it in the escrow account. Around the same time, the title company is going to do a title search and issue a title report. And that report is going to state who exactly owns the property that's being bought, right? Making sure that it's actually the seller's property and they have all the rights associated with being able to sell it. The buyer is going to order a home inspection and pop the hood and make sure that everything's good with the house. And any of the things that they're concerned about, they will negotiate with the seller and ask them to either repair it or reimburse them for. Around the same time, the seller is going to send the buyer the SRPD, which is the seller's real property disclosure form. Now here in Nevada, that needs to be sent to the buyer within the first 5 days of the deal. And what this form explains is if there's been any issues in the past when the seller has owned the property, they're going to explain to the buyer what those issues have been and how they've dealt with it or how it's still a problem. So issues with appliances, electrical, water damage, mold, anything like that, the buyer should know and the seller will tell you in this SRPD form. So we just said how after the home inspection, right, you're going to negotiate repairs with the seller. And once that's done, around a few days after that, generally, we're going to see the due diligence period end, right? So the due diligence period is from day 1 until whenever it was pre-negotiated, let's say around day 10. Now, the important things to know about that whole due diligence period is that you as a buyer can cancel your deal for any reason whatsoever during the due diligence period. If you cancel because you feel like it after due diligence ends, right, then you're going to have to figure out another reason to cancel it. So pay attention of when your due diligence ends. Now, after the due diligence period, I generally see appraisals happen. But like I said, it could happen before if they're ordered early. The appraisal is ordered by the lender, paid for by the buyer. And what's happening is an appraisal will come in and they'll basically look at the property and figure out what the value of the property is based on what's inside the house and how houses outside or around that area are selling. A few days later, in the middle of the deal, let's call it day 15, the HOA docs are going to be delivered from the seller to the buyer. Now, the seller has to remember to order these documents in a timely fashion, usually during the first third of the deal, because some HOAs take 7 to 10 days for those documents to come in. And once those docs come in, the buyer has 5 days to decide if they want to live in that HOA. If there's some crazy rules they don't like, they can sign, hey, this is not for me, and they can get out of the deal, no questions asked. Let's continue. So on day 18 to 20, we'll say, the appraisal contingency should expire. And remember, that contingency, that period started from day 1 and went all the way to here, which like we said is day 18 to 20 on average. Now during that time period, if you had an appraisal done and the appraisal came back lower than expected, meaning lower than the purchase price that was agreed upon, the appraisal contingency, this clause states that the buyer has the right to renegotiate if the appraised value is lower than the actual agreed upon value. You can't come to an agreement of how to handle it, the buyer can get out of the deal and get their deposit back. A few days later, generally, we see the loan contingency period end, which again starts from the beginning and goes all the way to, let's say, day 20 to 23 on average, maybe 22, 23. And this contingency, this clause states that if the buyer cannot get approved for a loan, there obviously cannot be a deal. You can't buy a house without the money needed to purchase that home, right? So if they cannot get approved for the deal, if they get denied for the loan in the course of the escrow, they can get out of the deal as long as it happens before this contingency ends. Now your first question might be like, wait a second, I see loan approval over here. What if we're denied for the loan between the loan contingency and the loan approval? Which is a great question. But generally you're gonna know way before this period whether or not the loan is going well. Your lender will tell you sometime here, hey, listen, these docs you said were gonna be available are not available. The numbers you put down are not checking out. You did some stuff we said you shouldn't do. It's not looking good. And they will give you ample time and even write a letter, obviously, for the seller, for the listing agent, so they know you're not lying and that you actually can't get the loan. So don't worry that there's a gap between the loan contingency and the approval. You're generally gonna know if you're not gonna be approved prior to the contingency ending. So if there's no issues and the loan's going well, a few days after the contingency ends, you should have the loan approval, right? Finally. Now, one thing about this is that once the loan is approved, the lender is then going to issue loan docs to the title company. And the title company is going to hold them until the buyer comes on the last day generally and signs those loan docs along with the other ownership docs so that the money can be officially funded and released to the seller later on. But before we get there, we got to do the final walkthrough. So if the loan approval happens around, let's say, day 25 and our full thing is 30 days, then the final walkthrough will happen on day like 28 or 29. And during that final walkthrough, the buyer's walking through the property, obviously. They're going to make sure that any repairs that were negotiated are done. They're going to make sure there's no new damage to the property since the last time they saw it. They're going to make sure that the property is clean. Once that's good, they'll sign a form that releases them, and then we get to the final closing date of the deal. Now, on the closing date, the buyer should be signing their docs, signing their loan documents, signing their ownership docs. And once everything is completed, right, and you might be wondering, hey, where's the seller signing their docs? That can happen on the last day, or it can happen usually a day or two before. It really just depends on the seller and the title company. But on the last day, the buyer usually signs their docs, and once everything's done, this whole packet will then get released to the county, so the deed can now be put into the name of the buyer. Once that deed is recorded in the buyer's name, they're officially the owner. They can get the keys, and finally, the title company can now do the disbursement of funds to the seller so they can get their money for the property. So that's a good breakdown of how the escrow period unfolds. Again, some of these things might be different on certain deals, but this is an average time frame that I've seen, at least here in Nevada. And that concludes our Real Estate for Beginners series. I'm Gershon Levy. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel. And if you guys ever have any questions about this series, Las Vegas, or our real estate market, then please don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks so much and have a great day.